Bob. Well, I will wrap things up. I realized at the beginning of the session I forgot to introduce myself. So I'm Alec Murphy, a professor of geography at the University of Oregon. And it was my privilege to work with Peter and with Ryan to help put together this session for this afternoon. When I was trying to figure out what I might say, I pulled out a citation I wrote for Harm for NCGE about 8 years ago. It was when he won the Miller Award. And I went through the citation, and I was always kind of proud of that, because I thought I managed to capture just what a force he was in geographic education. But Dick's comment reminded me that when Harm and I were talking about that several years later, the line in that entire citation that Harm enjoyed the most was when I said, it wrote something to the effect of, when Harm made the fateful decision to move to North America, he consigned himself to a lifetime of mispronunciation of his name. You know what I mean. The block 3 I want to make this afternoon that really is the most important. Because when I think in a broader sense about Harm and what he meant to me, I realize that Harm's greatest impact, in fact, may be that he made me want to be a better, more passionate, more adventurous geographer. And I guess as an extension, a better, more passionate, and more adventuresome human being. I was influenced by Harm's enthusiasm for geography, for life, and for the planet on which we live, and his insatiable desire to share that enthusiasm with others. That enthusiasm that he helped to infuse in me was something that was a bond between us. We got into the habit over the last 10 or 15 years of, after some adventure somewhere around the world, of writing at some length to one another about that. And he was actually interested in what I had to say, or at least he feigned it pretty well. And we'd sometimes engage in certain kind of travel and flight story one-upmanship. You couldn't really beat Harm at the process. But I gave him a run for his money on a few occasions, which was kind of fun to do. But the fact that somebody actually was not just, oh, where have you been? Oh, fine, now let me tell you about last night's dinner, but was so interested in the observations and thoughts and comments I had, particularly when it was something a little bit outside the normal. And that awareness, even of these exchanges, encouraged me and sometimes to do things maybe I wouldn't have otherwise done. I remember being in Libreville about 8-9 years ago, and for this audience, of course, I don't have to explain that Libreville is in Gabon. And I was I've been at a conference there for a couple of days. I was about to head into the Gabonese interior, but my hotel looked down on a vast shanty town. And I remember thinking, there are so many places like Rio de Janeiro. To wander into a shanty town would be to take one's life in one's hand. But here is a place where there's no culture of preying on tourists or anything. I write about shanty towns. I want to understand them better. And I remember thinking, Harm would really appreciate what I'm about to do, which was to leave my valuables in the hotel room and just head off. And for 2 hours, I wandered around a shanty town, a huge shanty town in Libreville with an incredible following of children, as you can imagine, after a little while. And I just felt Harm was with me on the walk. And Harm's been with me in that way and a whole lot of other things that I have experienced, encountered as well. Just last fall, I stood on the edge of Ngorongoro crater in northern Tanzania. It's a truly awesome beauty to stand on that crater's edge. And I use the word awesome advisedly because it's a hugely overused word these days that I avoid like the plague. And I remember various conversations with Harm about the overuse of certain words and how they become debased in their meaning, but it was awesome. And my experience and enjoyment of being on that crater edge was partly a reflection of conversations I had had with Harm over the years about what a thrilling moment it was when he first visited that crater. All these things rushed through my mind when I pulled into the Costco parking lot in Eugene, Oregon some 5 months ago to return a call I had received while on the road and dutifully did not answer. The call was from Harm. He was in the hospital. I knew in a few minutes he was facing long odds. I also knew he was a fighter, so despite the long odds, I didn't give up. And in fact, in conversations we had over the next week to 10 days, I was always heartened, even after he went through some really hair-raising medical procedures, that we'd talk about the medical stuff for a few minutes, and then it was off to talking about Ukraine, or something else that was going on in the news in the very early days of the unfolding of what we've seen happening in Ukraine over the last few months. But then the call stopped. I was headed off to Southeast Asia, and 10 days later, I got the news that Harm had died. And I use the word died advisedly, because I remember another comment from Harm at one point about the verbal euphemisms we use, the failure of Americans sometimes to call a spade, passed on, passed away. Harm died, and that was hard news. It was hard indeed not to be selfish in the immediate aftermath of that news. Who would care so much about my travel stories? Who would treat me to such nice bottles of wine? Who would inspire me to crash into the next shanty town in the next place I was around the world? But of course, none of these things has really disappeared. Well, except maybe the nice bottle of wine. For what Harm ultimately gave me is what he gave all of us, no matter what our relationship was with him. Just a reader of his materials, a listener to his videos, or someone who knew him in some ways. What he gave me, what he gave us, was the lust to explore and learn, to be a traveler, not just a tourist. A heightened fascination with the diversity of our planet and the desire to tell others about it. A heightened willingness to take some risks in the effort to learn and understand more. And ultimately, a greater love of geography as a way of thinking, a way of seeing, a way of being. So Harm, we salute you for what you were, for what you gave us, and for helping to nurture in each of us a burning passion for many of the things that you held dear that will always be with us.